I'd say Hegel, yourself, and Tillich are my biggest influences theologically.
That's a beautiful thing to say. I'm going to have to take a snippet of that. I would not be worthy to tie their sandals, but those are two thinkers I deeply respect. And you've hit on Hegel and Tillich as very profound thinkers who I have sucked so much from. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, because Tillich talks about, and this probably connects to your idea that this theism and atheism, they aren't as diametrically opposed, or perhaps they are, but at least there's a dance between them that goes on. And so Tillich says that non-being is a part of being in a kind of a dialectical sense. And this probably gets me to one of your most interesting or insightful concepts. So in many of your talks, you discuss that, we have the Kantian notion. There's what we can perceive, what we can know. And then he'd call it the thing in itself, or that which we can't know, or to use a Lacanian term, I don't know if it's a proper term, like das Ding or whatnot. But then you say, oh, but what Hegel did was Hegel said that this thing that was epistemological, he kind of says, no, it's ontological. So if we could, I hope this is not going to sound like patronizing, but if we could, let's say, take that idea of the what's epistemological and bringing it to the we're taking it to the ontological domain, to the audience that you wrote this book for, How Not to Speak of God, which are people that aren't particularly too keen on philosophy, let's say. How would you articulate that concept?
Yeah, okay, that's great. I'll tell you, I'll say where I start with that question, and then we maybe go a little bit deeper. But that book that you held up there, which is my first book, How Not to Speak of God, that was written partly to introduce people to the richness of the mystical tradition and to the first kind of understanding of how atheism interacts with theism, which is where you get it in Pseudo-Dionysius, and you get it in basically mystics right the way through to their heyday. It was obviously in the past, but you still get some mystical thinkers in the modern world. And it was this idea that doubt, unknowing, and complexity are not opposed to the life of faith, but are part of the life of faith. And that concept, kind of introducing that, I think that was, especially when I wrote that book, within some circles, both theistic and atheistic, was the idea that religion was a thing of certainty, was a thing of banishing doubt, of banishing unknowing, of having or pretending to have certainty and satisfaction. And using Tillich is very good at this, actually, is arguing that in the life of faith, there is an ongoing conversation, like almost being invited into theology is being invited into a conversation. It's almost like going to an art gallery, and instead of thinking that what unifies you with other people who love the same artist is that you have the correct interpretation of the same art, it's more that you're all in love with the same art, and it speaks to you in different ways. And when you go to the art gallery, you engage with the art, you allow it to saturate you, you allow it to speak to you in ever new ways. So in a similar way, theology, and this is very true in the Jewish tradition, it's not an invitation into a set of dogmatic beliefs. It's an invitation into a set of questions and a set of conversations and a set of rituals and practices. So that was kind of the notion of the book. But I don't want to stop there. And you mentioned the difference between epistemological unknowing and ontological unknowing, and that's very key. So epistemological unknowing, for your listeners and your watchers, is basically the idea that there are things that we do not know. And of course, there's loads of things we don't know. And I watch YouTube videos and stuff I don't know all the time. I actually watch computer stuff sometimes because it's an area I don't know anything about. And so I'll fall asleep listening to what a chip is, like how a computer works, right? So there's all these things that I don't know. And then on top of that, that idea that there's things I don't know, but I could know, right? So there's that kind of unknowing. There's also unknowing of things that none of us know at the moment, but maybe in the future we'll know. So the idea that science is progressing and there's things in terms of physics and quantum particles that we don't currently know, that, you know, how they interact in certain ways, and you know, etc. How the weak force and quantum gravity works, whatever, right? But we'll one day will know. And then there's the Kantian notion, which you mentioned, which is there a type of reality that we can never know because we filter it through our minds, we filter it through our senses, we filter it through language? So there is a reality that is always unknown to us. It is knowable, and it, as in, it knows itself. It can kind of, it is a whole and substantive thing, but we cannot know it. So those are three types of epistemological unknowings. Ontological unknowing is kind of, this is where it gets more radical. I think confessional Christianity can embrace all of the epistemological unknowing. In fact, I think at its most mature form, it does that. What I want to argue for, and you know, people don't have to go with me on this, but I'll set it out. It's something a little bit more radical. And this, if you allow me to tell a story, that
Oh, please do. I love your stories. Go for it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
This is actually a story that I told
Yeah.
like 30 years ago, 30 years ago when I first started as a public speaker. I then dropped it, and I've only been telling it again very recently. And so the story is about three people who all die on the same day in different parts of the world, right? This mystic, this pastor, and this fundamentalist preacher. And they all go up to heaven. And as you know, you have to get an interview with Jesus before you get into heaven, right? Matthew 14. So you have to, they're all sitting there. And St. Paul comes out and says to the mystic, okay, your turn for the interview. So the mystic goes in, little signs turned around on the door. And the mystic's in there for about an hour. And then he totters out and he smiles to himself and goes, I knew I was wrong. I knew I was wrong. And kind of walks into heaven. Next is the pastor's turn, this evangelical pastor. He gets up, goes into the interview room. He's in there for about 3 hours. And he comes out, but he's distraught. He goes, how could I have been so wrong? And then he walks into heaven. And then finally, it's the fundamentalist turn, and he gets up. He's got a well-worn Bible with all of this highlighting. He walks into the office. It's closed. The little signs turned around. He's in there for about 8 hours. And finally, the door swings open, and Jesus comes out and says, how could I have been so wrong? Right? Now, you know, that's a
God
funny
himself.
little, yes, exactly. So that's a funny little story that when I told it originally, I told it naively. And by naively, I mean, I told it going, we're supposed to identify with the mystic, right? In that story, it's kind of a little funny, ha. And the mystic is the one who's right. The fundamentalist is wrong, right? But recently, I would say that I've been telling it and going, no. The fundamentalist is the one who is right. Or I'll say it in a more precise way, the fundamentalist is the one who experienced salvation in this moment in the interview room. Because what happened is the fundamentalist, and let's think of it as any young militant believer. I mean, any young militant, anything, but say a believer who knows the answer, knows the truth, and then they interrogate it. They're always interrogating the truth. They know the truth. They ask questions. Just like when I went to philosophy class as a 20-something-year-old, I already knew all the answers. I just needed philosophy to give me the justification for it, right? I was that confident. And what happened is I discovered that the lecturers didn't know. Right. And Heidegger talks about this. He says it's not the students don't know and the lecturers know. The students all know and the lecturers don't. And the role of the lecturer, in a sense, is to bring you into a learned unknowing, to kind of open you up to a series of productive questions, become an hysteric in psychoanalytic terms. Right. So in this story, the mystic is the one who is a Kantian. It's epistemological unknowing. Hey, I don't know the truth. The truth is out there, but I don't know it. The fundamentalist encounters something absolutely traumatic, a subjective destitution, you'd call it, right? Because what does the fundamentalist experience? In questioning the absolute, in questioning absolute truth breaks and says, I don't know. So he discovers that there is an unknowing or an alienation at the heart of reality itself. Now, for me, that is the name of a type of salvation. Because, and here it is in a nutshell, is we as human beings are marked and we can unpack this, but marked by a fundamental sense of lack. To be a human is to be marked with a sense of something missing, an oceanic oneness that we do not have. And everyone's promising that they can fill that with psychedelics, commodity satisfaction, polyamory, whatever you want, new car. Everyone's got an answer to how to fill the lack. And the most religious place in the world is actually LA, right? Because everyone there is promising certainty and satisfaction and wholeness and completeness. And on Instagram, everybody seems to be uncastrated. But if you go with this idea that we have a lack, and then we encounter religion, we kind of go, God lacks the lack. And we want to be unified with the absolute so that we can get rid of this sense of alienation. Well, salvation in the radical tradition is the realization that God is alienated as well, that lack or nothingness or castration is woven into the very nature of reality. And actually how we overcome alienation is not by overcoming it, but by redoubling it, by realizing that our own unhappiness, our own dissatisfaction is actually part of the nature of everything, and that actually it's a satisfying dissatisfaction. That's where all of our meaning and all of our suffering and all of our joy arises from. And so in Christianity, I would argue that what you have in the death of God is the idea that I feel that I'm alienated from God, and this is awful. And then in Christ, I say, oh, God's alienated from God. and in that experience of division within everything, death loses its sting. It loses its weight. That lack loses its negative power and becomes something affirmative. That's ontological unknowing. So epistemological unknowing is I do not know the absolute. Ontological knowing is the absolute does not know itself. There is novelty, spontaneity, and unknowing at the heart of everything.
And then the kind of the theological line you draw is along with Zizek is this is where Christ goes on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Father, Father,
Yes.
why have thou forsaken me? And that is that moment where God himself, that's the ontological unknowing kind of
Yes.
Portrayed in the Bible, let's say, right?
Yeah, and potentially like that's the explosion of this idea within religion. You have, I mean, the idea of us being separated from some oceanic oneness is common in everything, even in certain forms of therapy. The idea of the mother, you're separated from the mother other, and that's basically separation from this, this being at the mother's breast, this oneness. So that's a form of that as well, where it's a basically original blessing, fall, and then return. That's the kind of religious paradigm. This instead is saying something more radical, which is that I mean, in a nutshell, is that the separation from the mother is what creates us. It's not that we have a unity and then we're separated, is that subjectivity is the result of a fundamental death, a fundamental loss. And so it constitutes us, which is what in theology you could call original sin, or meaning original lack. There's a constitutive lack that is within us, and you don't get rid of the lack, you forgive the lack. So to pay a debt means to fill it. If I owe you $100 and someone pays that debt, the debt is like a lack. There's a lack of money, and someone pays it. If you forgive the debt, you don't fill it. You render the lack lacking. You render the nothing a nothing. So the forgiveness of lack simply means that you don't overcome it, but somehow you learn to live within it, and it's robbed of its poison.